All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for your patience for a couple minutes while we figure this out. I understand there's a sorority coming in after, so I think we'd like to wrap up before then, unless they want to learn a little bit about neuroscience. So let's get into it. The first talk that we're going to be doing is on neuroanatomy. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of this group as well. Just out of curiosity, who in here is not part of NXT previously? You? All right, 2? Okay, awesome. Well, I saw you at the last meeting, right?
I went to one meeting.
That counts. You're part. And you're part now too. Okay, sounds good. I'll go over a quick overview then of what NXT is as well. But like I said, there are going to be a series of talks that I'm going to give and John's going to give the last one. So we're covering neuroanatomy, which is the structure and function of the brain and nervous system. We're going to be covering neurophysiology, which is my favorite topic in neuroscience, which is looking into how neurons communicate with each other. I think it's particularly interesting if you're an electrical engineer or interested in electronics, because it's really cool how our biological systems sort of imitate that naturally, or maybe our systems imitate the natural systems. Neuroprosthetics, so talking about devices that directly interface with the nervous system to control external devices or to help us overcome certain maladies that the brain might have, certain issues that we might have. And then finally, John will give us a talk on neurostimulation to talk about how we can repair parts of the brain and nervous system that have gone wrong, as well as enhance them to make ourselves smarter or whatever else. So just a quick about me. I think most of you know me, but just to go over this very quickly. So I'm a 5th-year student in undergrad right now at RIT, and I'm in a program where I take classes over at U of R as well. So I'm in the School of Individualized Study here. Primary concentration is neuroscience, which again is over at U of R, and then I'm doing business and design as well. I've been interested in neurotechnology since about 2013 when I saw a paralyzed woman controlling a robotic arm just with her mind, able to feed herself after 15 years of not being able to move. So I was just captivated from it at that point and have been interested in studying it since then. Founded this organization as a research group in 2018 with my business partner, and it was originally a research organization, but we turned it into a club at the beginning of this year to make it more accessible. I founded a YouTube channel called the BCI Guys, which if you're interested in neurotech, learning more, you can take a look at that. We do little brain-computer interface projects as well as make educational videos if you want to expand on this topic a little bit more. I'm currently doing haptics research with EEG, which is like a cap that takes signals from your brain, and fMRI over at U of R right now. And like I'm doing right now, I give talks and run workshops occasionally on neurotech and sometimes neuroscience. And this is one of the course that the BCI guys produced. If you're interested in neurotech, you can search Foundations of Neurotechnology. Just a little self-plug there. If you want to go through, it takes about 5 hours on the short track and 15 total if you're really interested in neurotech. And it covers these topics of what is neurotech, basic neuroanatomy like we're going to go over today, brain functioning, types of neurotech, some ethics, and some other stuff in there. So if you're interested, just putting that out there as a resource, but we'll get into it in a second. NXT, like I mentioned, is a club that works with neurotechnology and brain-computer interface devices. It's mostly for the new people here. And so we have a lot of different teams working on thought keyboards, some games, prosthetics, making open source brain data, a lot of stuff like that, controlling a wheelchair. So if you're interested in any of that or learning more about neuroscience or neurotech, we highly recommend that you come to our meetings and check us out. We've been recognized in some of RIT's publications and videos. RIT sent us to Dubai to present at a maker fair. And we do lots of local events. All right, with all that out of the way, let's actually get into the main topic. So let's start talking about neuroanatomy, which again is the structure and function of the brain and the relationship between those. So the topics that we're going to go over are first, I'm going to talk about why we might want to study neuroanatomy and how do we actually study the brain. Go over the gross neuroanatomy, so the 3 main parts, 4 lobes of the cerebrum, the midbrain, some lower area structures, how we feel and sense with each one of our senses and where that happens in the brain. And then if we get to it with time, we will talk about the neurons and the cells that help it out, And if we do not get to that this time, I will include that in the next talk on neurophysiology. So why study the brain? Let me, where's my phone? Oh. So why study the brain? Well, as I said in my little rant, I don't know if people saw the email, I got very excited and started talking about the capabilities of the brain. But it's a really incredible structure and the most complex structure in the known universe that we are aware of. It is, as I said in there, it does about 10,000 trillion computations per second, which is way more than any computer that we have available right now, and it runs all on 20 watts of energy. It's estimated that a comparable computer would be running on about a gigawatt of energy, which would require like a full nuclear power plant to be able to do the level of computations that we can do. And now, we might think like, oh, well, our computers are a lot faster. They can do math better than we are. They can do simulations. But the brain has a very different goal. The brain is still dealing with a tremendous amount of information around us, visual information, contextual information, touch, every other sense. And what it's trying to do is aggregate that all into the simulation of consciousness, because that is the best way that we can sort of interpret all of this immense amount of data without getting overwhelmed by it. And so one example that I always turn to is sports and professional sports, because it's really amazing seeing professional athletes use their brains to control their bodies in ways where they're predicting physics and able to connect a ball to a bat, for example. And so a professional pitcher, if let's say they throw the ball at 100 miles an hour, you only get 3 frames, so 3 equivalent frames if you're thinking of like a video feed or something like that, from the ball leaving the pitcher's hand to the time it reaches the batter, which is really not that many. But our brains have gotten so good at interpreting physics and understanding that trajectory that they can actually hit that ball. And that's a really, really incredible thing. And all of that feeling smooth as a simulation is just the brain's immense ability to do processing. So I think all of that stuff is really, really incredible, and it is really exciting to me. But in terms of why you might want to study the brain, this could be, one, because again, you have an incredible structure in all of your heads, and why not want to learn more about it? But 2, if you want to build devices that work with the brain, you should definitely know what the brain is doing. Even if you want to make things like video games, or maybe you're designing a UI or an application, it's really important to know how our brain works, how our brain is tricked, and what our brain likes to do, because all of that is going to be really helpful in making interfaces and products that are more effective. And this pretty much goes across any discipline. Pretty much any discipline you work with is going to be working with people in some way. Everybody has a brain, so the more you can learn about that, the more advantages you'll have in that. And also, if you're interested in mental health and the underpinnings of that, neuroscience is very important for that as well. So how do we study the brain? There are 4 main ways that we can look into how the brain works. So this can be functional and structural imaging, taking pictures of the brain, assessing the effects of brain damage, Brian damage, do that all the time, assessing the effects of brain damage. So when you have a stroke or epilepsy or you get a concussion, what parts of the brain are actually damaged and what effects does that have on our functioning? Examining how neurons are connected and recording electrical activity from those neurons to see which neurons are talking to who. So just to go through some of these very quickly, fMRI is a combination of MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, and then looking at blood flow within that. So MRI gives us the structure of the brain. It looks at changing polarity of different atoms, and it's able to do that and take images and slices, which can give us a beautiful 3D model that show us what our brain structure looks like. And then the functional part is looking at blood flow as it goes through the brain, with the understanding that areas that are active need to take in more blood flow than normal. And so we can put people through tasks, asking them to do math or respond to emotional images or do some sort of motor task, and look at what areas light up in the brain, and then we have a pretty good idea that, well, those areas are probably really important in doing that activity. Then we also have something called DTI imaging, diffusion tensor imaging over here, which helps us look at the circuitry of the brain in these really, really beautiful diagrams. We also have PET and CT scanning, which really I just put this up here because I think the images are pretty. Basically, they inject a radioactive tracer into your body that is not that dangerous in small doses. It goes into your brain, and again, we track where it goes in blood flow, understanding that the areas that require more blood are more active. And then we have X-rays as well. So this is a CT scan. Other than that, we can look at brain damage. I'm not sure if you've heard the story before, but there was a guy, Phineas Gage, over on the right, and he worked at a stone quarry, I believe. But basically, he was working with these big, long shafts, driving them into the stone, and then using explosives to pry that stone open. And one of these spikes, specifically the one that he's holding, got shot up and went actually through his eye and through his brain here, and knocked out a big part of his prefrontal cortex. And from that, we learned that part of the brain, and he lived for, I think it was another like 10, 15 years after that, which is kind of crazy. But his personality was radically different. And so from that, we understood that this area is important in emotional regulation and has a lot to do with our personalities. And so a ton of neuroscience, pretty much before like the 1950s or so, this is how we learned about the brain, is pretty much somebody gets hurt, what happens? And then we have brain staining as well. I have this little book up here from my favorite neuroscientist, Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who in the early 1900s would stain neurons with ink, and he was the first person, with another person, Camillo Golgi, to start writing down and actually see what neurons look like. And now we use other staining techniques as well that give us these beautiful images. This is a little slice of the brain there. And then this is one of my favorite topics, but I won't cover it today more than this, which is now we use virus tracers that get absorbed by the neurons, and they bring something called green phosphorescent protein, which basically all that means is we can make neurons glow when they activate by injecting virus into them. And I think that's really cool, and this is kind of the current standard of how we do staining. And then finally, within that, we have electrical recording as well. And so you can put an electrode into a neuron and actually pick up the spikes from that, and that's how we determine connections between them. All right. So how are we on time? Just so I know. Well, I know we're good. What time is it?
You got another, it's currently 6:15.
Okay, yeah, just for pacing myself. Perfect. All right, so now we're actually going to get into the neuroanatomy here. We'll talk about the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. And then very briefly, we'll touch on the peripheral nervous system as well, although that is not our main focus. So for the peripheral nervous system, as John was helping us out with before we started, that collects sensory information and brings it to the central nervous system. So that's, your sense of touch and things like that. And then it also helps drive our muscles, obviously, by getting signals from the brain. And then it's also important for controlling all of our organs and internal regulation. And so we have the somatic system is things that we have conscious control over. Autonomic system is controlling muscles like that in your heart, which thankfully we do not have conscious control over because that would be exhausting. And then we have your fight or flight system. Sympathetic system makes you not sympathetic. It makes you run around and have that fight or flight response. And then the parasympathetic system calms you down a little bit from there. But again, the main focus is going to be on the central nervous system, which all the central nervous system is located within bone. So that could be within the vertebrae of the spinal cord, or of course in the brain. So that's kind of the main designation that we use, although there are cellular elements as well that are important to that. And yeah, I mean, this is pretty much everything else. Interprets sensory input, movements, thinking, all that stuff. We'll get into it. So first, we're going to start with the spinal cord. And forgive me for going fast through this. I know we don't have a ton of time, and I want to get mainly into the brain stuff. But first, we have the spinal cord here, which its primary function is to just transport motor and sensory information up to the brain and out to the body. But it does some other pretty cool things as well, where the brain, when it says that I want to move this leg forward, it kind of just determines the direction. I want to move this arm up, move it over there. but it's actually the spinal cord that's coordinating all of the muscles. The brain is not doing that. It's coordinating all of the muscles to actually make that movement happen. And so, especially in the lower spinal cord that control our legs, your gait control is controlled in here by an internal clock. And so they did a study where they severed the spinal cord of a cat and then used motor signals from the brain and sent it there. And they found that by just changing the voltage that you're giving to that, you could make the cat move faster and slower and actually get it to walk just from those electrical impulses. So it's kind of crazy that all of that just kind of comes from here. And the brain is really good at setting these rhythms. It also does reflexes on its own. Those signals don't get up into the brain until after you've moved them. So we've got three main parts of the brain. Now we're moving up to the brain. So we've got, this is a real brain preserved over here. And then we've got a slice of the brain. So taken this way, we're looking at the medial view, the middle of the brain. And there are three main parts that I want to focus on: the forebrain, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So starting off with the brainstem, this is our oldest structure, and this is what connects the spinal cord to the rest of the brain. And it does a lot of your essential life tasks. So it's helping with attention, but a lot of the brain does attentional stuff. It maintains our heart rate, our blood pressure, body temperature, digestion, breathing, urination, sleep, all of these things that are pretty essential to life. So suffice to say, any damage there is usually fatal, or it causes really big problems. But thankfully, the skull kind of goes all the way over here. Your eye is here, nose, mouth, and then the back of your skull goes over here. So it's really as well protected as it could be. And this is a big reason as to why the brain kind of evolved into this branching, maybe flower shape on the top. The cerebellum is this really, really wrinkly part that sits at the back of the brain, and cerebellum means little brain in Latin. And this is largely, there's still a lot that needs to be explored into what this does, but we know for sure that it's really important in fine motor coordination. So the top parts of your brain decide where to move your arm, but the cerebellum is the difference between me being able to touch my nose like this and me slapping myself in the face. And so it sort of helps get that last couple inches in order of where you want to go. And it helps refine those, the precision and timing of those movements. But there's some research to show that it might be important in wakefulness, emotion, and even some language. And that kind of makes sense with like our specific ability to modulate muscles and contort muscles that might be important in speech. And this is one other thing to mention is it's really, really densely packed with neurons. It's estimated to have about half of the 86 billion neurons that our brain has in total. About half of them are in this little area, which is, I think, quite interesting. And it's really, really pretty when you see a half section. So the human brain is actually not the biggest brain out there. I mentioned we have 86 billion neurons, but the African elephant actually has upwards of 130 billion neurons. But we all know that African elephants are not smarter than humans, or not quite at that level of intelligence. And that is because of, well, actually, does anybody have a guess as to why that is? Yeah.
Are a lot of them dedicated to like the bigger body mass? Like,
yeah, close to that. So yeah, they have a lot more muscles to coordinate than we do. And so that means, and of course the trunk has a ton of muscles in it. I forget exactly how many, but I think it's a couple hundred. And they have a really, really, really big cerebellum. So actually 80% of their neurons are in this area, which isn't dedicated to higher cognitive function. It's just dedicated to that fine dexterity that's needed with their trunk. So I always think that that's interesting. And there's a size comparison there. And then finally, we have kind of the most exciting part, which is where all of our thinking and consciousness and emotion comes from, which is the forebrain, also the cerebrum. There are so many times when neuroscientists, I feel like, just to be confusing, have many, many different names for things. So I am just going to pick one or two for most of this. And but just know if you're ever interested in reading neuroscience papers that it can be all over the place. But this is important for Oops, I see that this was not updated, so we're just going to go through because I will say in each of these what, what those do. All right, so what are the three parts of the brain? Three main parts of the brain. This is for Candy. Very important. Yes?
Cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem.
Got it.
Which one? Jolly Rancher or
Can-
Twizzlers?
Please clap. All right, we got there. Maybe we'll save the rest of those for the end when you get one correct, but very good, thank you. So,
My cerebellum did not help me there.
yeah, so just reviewing again, so you got them all correctly. Very good, you're paying attention. So we have the forebrain or the cerebrum. We've got the brainstem in here. The midbrain is often seen as a part of the cerebrum, which is why I didn't talk about that. And then we have the cerebellum sitting at the back. So now we're going to talk about the cerebrum, which is kind of the most exciting area, like I said, and go into a little bit more depth about that. So you might notice that the cerebrum, or just our brains in general, are really, really wrinkly. And so these wrinkles, these little hills, they have names. And so the hills are called, singular is gyrus, and together multiple are gyri. And then these little valleys here are called a sulcus or multiple sulci. Does anyone have an idea as to why our brains are wrinkly? I know for those of you that were here for the last one, this might be review, but does anybody else have an idea as to why the brain is wrinkly? Yes?
Can you provide more surface area?
Yes, definitely. So the top layer of our brain, we'll do that at the end. So you've got candy. You've got candy. I don't want anybody to get hurt. So the top layer of our brain actually has most of the neurons that are necessary for higher order function and sensation, and most of the neurons in our cerebrum. And so it's just the first couple millimeters where those neurons are, and all the inside is just wiring. So our brain wants to pack in as many neurons as possible, so you're absolutely right, and have as much surface area as possible. So if the brain were completely smooth, we would get about 16 centimeters in length of cortex. But if it's unfolded, and it's about 16 centimeters squared if you were to kind of pull this apart when it comes down. But the unfolded cortex ends up being 48 centimeters squared. So you can see this is relative size. You get a lot more brain area. So very, very good. And then these sulci and gyri are really, really important for helping us understand what we're looking at in the brain. So we all have, our brains on the large scale are all pretty similar. There are some small differences that you can detect, but one thing that neuroscientists or neurosurgeons, whoever's looking at the brain, what they'll do is look for these big sulci, or sometimes they're called fissures when they're really, really deep. And they look at this to know how to divide up the brain and what they're looking at. So you have each of these that divides up the 4 lobes of the brain, which we will talk about in a second. But really important ones are the longitudinal fissure, which I think everybody pretty much knows that our brain has 2 hemispheres. The cerebrum specifically has 2 hemispheres. And so this is that big deep valley that goes in between them. And then we have the central sulcus and the lateral fissure that help separate these parts of the brain there. So I mentioned that there are 4 lobes. We split them into these lobes based on those sulci, gyri, and fissures that I just spoke about. And so we have the frontal lobe up here at the front. That makes sense. Temporal lobe, which is right down here by your temples. So also makes sense why we would call it that. Parietal lobe up on the top of your brain. And then occipital lobe is where we do our visual processing. So that kind of makes sense there, like optics. And I'll go through what each of them does. So the frontal lobe is where most of our higher order cognitive processing comes in. So this area is really, really important for humans. And if you look at other brains of other animals, their brains have a much, much smaller frontal lobe. So this is important for planning and reasoning and personality, like we saw with Phineas Gage a couple slides back. It's also really important for emotional regulation. BCI guys made a little bit of a video on this, but an interesting thing for anybody that gets panic attacks, this area of the brain is supposed to regulate the part of your brain that makes you panic. And so what that area does, the part that makes you panic, actually cuts off blood flow to this frontal lobe, making it so that it can't regulate that area. So one tip that psychologists may give is to try to do math or to write or do something that requires memory, because if you can engage those higher level areas, you actually bring blood flow back here and it's easier to pull yourself out of that panic attack. And I just think that's an interesting little thing. This also does all of our motor actions and speech, and it does short-term memory and sensory integration, which just means it's very important for consciousness, bringing together all of our senses to give us one smooth percept of reality. We also have the temporal lobe. So moving down, we've got the temporal lobe, which is important in emotion. So this houses those areas that kind of fight with the frontal lobe that make us a little bit scared or happy or experience other emotions. It's important in hearing. The primary hearing area is over here. And then really important in long-term memory. So there's an area in here called the hippocampus, which I'll talk about later, but that encodes our memories, makes them long-term. And if the memories have been encoded long enough, for even just 15 minutes or longer, they can become a structure in your brain that is permanent for the rest of your life. Now, you might lose the ability to access that, but your brain is forever changed and constantly updated by the memories that we have, which I always think is a cool little thing, that when you talk to somebody or get to know someone, they actually are in some very small way changing the physical structure of your brain. And so you have a representation of that person in your brain, which I've always thought is really sweet and interesting. And same thing with things that you like or are interested in. And one area in here that I wanted to talk about that I think is pretty cool is the fusiform face area. So there are a lot of areas in the brain that are dedicated to finding individual features, but the human brain is particularly good at identifying faces. And so there's this area here where pretty much all of that processing happens. And sometimes there are deficiencies in this area, which is called prosopagnosia. And that is when people can't recognize faces. So they can still see. When they're looking at somebody, they can recognize, oh, there's a person there, and they can see the structure of the nose and the eyes, but they don't put it together and understand that it's a face. And so there's this famous artist called Chuck Close who has prosopagnosia, and he paints portraits of people. And basically how he does it is he goes up and he looks almost pixel by pixel and tries to put them together. And he still can't see the full composition as a face. But it's really interesting to see the individual contours and the shapes of which he puts a face together, even though his complete drawing he can't recognize as the face of the person that he was painting. And this was a self-portrait that he made. We've also got in the back the occipital lobe, which I mentioned is important in vision. So our eyes are up here and they send a pathway here. And vision is our most dominant sense, and so a ton of the brain is dedicated to that. But the start of the processing starts here, and then it kind of moves down to the front and up here, and it keeps circling back. But this area is important for depth perception, color, and early object recognition. And that fusiform face area that I talked about is right next to it in the temporal lobe. Finally, we've got the parietal lobe, which is up here on the top of your head, right behind that central sulcus. And this is really important in our sense of touch, proprioception, pain, temperature, all of that is up in that area, as well as, again, a really important area in attention and sensory integration. So bringing all of those senses together, important in consciousness and our perceptive reality, and understanding where objects are in space based on understanding sound information and visual information and other senses as well. That's part of that sensory integration. All right, quiz time for Candy. What are the 4 lobes? We'll do this one individually. So, yeah, sure. You had your hand up, so do you want to pick one? Say the color and what...
Orange would be temporal.
Yep. All right, so that's awesome. He gets another piece of candy. Do not throw it now. We learned our lesson the first time. Yes?
Purple's the frontal.
Purple is the frontal. Very good. We've got yellow and blue in the back, and then up here.
Blue would be occipital lobe.
Blue would be occipital lobe, perfect.
Yellow is parietal.
Yellow is parietal, excellent. All right, perfect. You guys are doing great. So now I want to dive into some smaller areas that are within these lobes that have more specific functionality and that are important. And now neuroscientists divide things up into increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller regions. The smallest that we consider a region is called a nuclei. And there can be sometimes hundreds or even thousands of little nuclei in given areas. So, but we're just going to focus on the broad areas that are important. So the prefrontal cortex is really that part of our brain that sets us apart from other animals. Ours is much, much larger than others, and this is where we have that executive functioning. So our mathematics ability, our planning ability, social and emotional regulation, like I was talking about before, and our behaviors and personalities seem to be mostly stored up in this area, because when there's damage there, people have very, very large personality shifts compared to in other areas of their brain. And there's also short-term memory up there, which makes sense because that's where a lot of your processing is going. A little bit of an interesting fact for those of you that are interested in computers, the brain has the equivalent of about 2.5 terabytes of RAM, which is kind of interesting. So that's your short-term memory, and then it has a virtually unlimited amount of long-term memory, which it can take between 5 and 15 minutes to encode that long-term memory. Then another important area, so this is in our parietal lobe, because we have that central sulcus, or the central fissure, that separates the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe. So we have this area called the somatosensory cortex. This does all of our touching and temperature and pain, proprioception, where our arms are in space. And this map is really interesting because it's not laid out in a one-to-one way. And what I mean by that is there are a lot more neurons dedicated to my fingertip, which is very, very tiny, compared to there may only be one neuron dedicated to this spot on my body. So finger is a lot smaller than a spot this big, but there may be hundreds of neurons in just this tiny little square centimeter area. And that makes sense because we have more ability to perceive objects with our hands. We touch lots of things, same with our lips. And so what that gives us is an overrepresentation by space in these areas. So we see hands are really important relative to other parts of our body, and the face, especially the lower lips, very, very important for where we sense things versus other places in our body. And so this, I should have given you a warning ahead of time that you're going to see a really grotesque image, but this is sort of a representation of that called the homunculus. Homunculus is Latin for little man, and there was a kind of eccentric neuroscientist in the mid-20th century. I mean, I think they all were eccentric neuroscientists in the mid-20th century before we had more rules regulating what they could do. But his name was Wilder Penfield, and he would basically poke at people's brains in open brain surgery and stimulate them with a little bit of electricity and ask them what they were feeling. And from that, he developed that map that we had just seen. And after he had kind of done that with a few patients, he ran down to his housekeeper, I think it was, because he knew that she could draw. And he was like, I need you to draw this thing that represents what I've been learning so I can show it to other people. And he went back and forth with her and back and forth with her for a while. And this was ultimately what they came up with as a representation of how our brain prioritizes where we feel things. So going through some of the other senses, just very quickly, because these are all really, really complex, and I could give multiple talks about each one of these. But vision is primarily processed in the back of the brain here. So this is that occipital lobe, which is split up into smaller sub-areas. But we have the vision obviously coming in from our eye. And one interesting thing about the eye is it is a part of the brain that is visible externally. If you grab a little flashlight, you look into someone's eyes, you are actually looking at the brain. That is a central nervous system structure, and we can tell that by the types of neurons that are in there. And so you can get a lot of information about brain health by looking into the eyes, which is one of the reasons that it's really important in concussion protocol. If somebody's ever shined a light in your eye, it's really helpful to understand kind of how your brain health is overall. But those signals travel back down into the back of the brain, and then they end up going up here, which helps us determine where something is, and then sort of all that feature detection goes here, and they meet in the front of the brain to figure out what you're actually looking at. For hearing, so obviously that starts in your ear, and then it moves through some lower structures in the brainstem, but ultimately it starts getting processed right here at the top of your temporal lobe, so that's an important area. And I'm highlighting all of these because if you're interested in neurotechnology and neuroprosthetics, then it's important to know where these are, because if you want to make a device that helps with hearing, you're going to want to interface with this area. With vision, you're going to want to go in the back. And there are plenty of devices that people have like implanted in the visual areas that can actually project low-level images just by stimulating that right now that we already have, and that will continue to develop for sure. So this is where we hear. Our sense of smell and our sense of taste are in these areas. So sense of smell is right down here, and then taste is in a bunch of little areas kind of deeper down. You can't see them from the surface, but they're in there. And the most important thing with that is that they are really close to the hypothalamus, which is that area that I said was really important in memory. So our sense of smell and our sense of taste evoke the strongest memories because they are right there and they have a very strong connection. So if you have like a loved one and they wore a specific perfume or had a certain scent, smelling that perfume evokes memories of them much stronger than even seeing images or hearing their voice or something like that. Another important one to talk about, especially in neuroprosthetics, is the motor system, because if you want to control something with your brain, you need to know what these areas are. And I will share the slides with these after if people are interested in looking at these with more depth. But basically, this area here in red is your primary motor cortex. So this is kind of the last stop that does all of that coordination to tell muscles where you want to move. And then these areas here kind of help us imagine and plan what we want to do. So once we decide that we want to move, then these areas say, okay, where do we want to move? What's that going to look like? If I move my hand up here, it should look like this. And then the motor cortex says, all right, let's actually bring this arm and bring it over here, and sends those signals down through the brainstem and out into the spinal cord to coordinate those muscles. And this is sort of a representation of that, where we start by deciding what we want to do, imagining it, realizing that action, and then sending it out through so that it can actually be utilized and control the body. And similar to the sensory homunculus, there is a motor homunculus as well, which is also represented by kind of the amount of muscles and dexterity that we want to have in different areas. So again, we see that the hand is overrepresented relative to body size. In fact, quite a bit more than even in the sensory or in the somatosensory homunculus. And that's just because we have a lot of different muscles in our hands relative to in other parts of our body. So even though like your bicep or your leg muscles might be a lot larger, it's still just a very simple muscle where you expand and contract, versus in the hand, you have a lot of little muscles that you need to be able to actuate very, very accurately. Some other important areas to talk about are speech and language. And so recently there have been a lot of studies coming out focusing on these areas specifically. There was a cool one earlier in the year that put an electrode grid right on top of this area, which is Broca's area, which helps us speak. This coordinates muscles to make speaking vocalizations and move our lips and understand the process of speech. And they put this array over it, and they were able to, with a pretty high degree of accuracy, it was somewhere around 80% accuracy. They were able to pick from a word bank of 50 words what the person was imagining saying, and they were able to type out some basic sentences, which is really, really incredible that we're at that point. And by looking at some other areas, there was a study that came out showing handwriting with 90 characters per minute, which is really crazy as well. Again, just imagining handwriting translates to letters. But if you have damage in Broca's area, you may still be able to understand language. Like if you ask someone, oh, go over there and pick up that, they might be able to do that, but they can't speak. They are completely unable to speak with that. But a really interesting thing, so this is all on the left side of the brain, which is important to note. the left side and the right side of the brain are mirrored in most functions, but there are some things like language that are pretty specific to one side. But one thing that I think is really cool is the other side of the brain that mirrors Broca's area is involved in music. So it's not involved in speech, but it is involved in lyrics and playing instruments, which is kind of interesting that humans would evolve to have a specialized area for that. And we're still not really sure why. But one thing that they'll do for stroke patients is if they have a stroke in this area and can't speak anymore, they'll teach them to sing their thoughts. And they actually are able to then speak again, just kind of in a sing-songy way. So there are some really interesting videos of people learning and realizing that they can do that. Then these back areas here are involved in understanding language, so helping translate written language, which makes sense because the visual areas are right there, go up to written language and then spoken language, which comes up from our ear, all kind of gets aggregated in this area. And similar to Broca's area, if you get damage there, kind of the opposite happens. You might be babbling, making sounds, saying random words, but you don't have an understanding of language. So that one is a little bit tougher to deal with.
15 minutes left.
15 minutes? Good. Okay, we're not too bad. We'll save the neuron for next time. So I want to talk about just, I think, 3 or 4 lower structures that are still in the cerebrum that are really important to talk about. So there's the limbic system here, which does a lot of our emotional regulation and homeostatic regulation. So this is going to be sending signals out to the rest of the body about how we're feeling, should we go to sleep, should we be in fight or flight mode, things like that. And the amygdala is involved in, there's a bad joke that I'm going to make again, even though I made it last time and nobody laughed at it, so looking at all of you this time. So the amygdala is involved in the 4 F's of neuroscience, which is fight, flight, feed, and reproduce. That would be the terrible joke. You can fill in what the 4th F is. Thank you, everyone. And then the hypothalamus is doing that regulation. And so the hippocampus is another area or right around that system that is involved in encoding long-term memory, like I mentioned before. And it is, and we know this because of someone called Henry Molaison, who was nicknamed HM until his death a couple years ago, and his actual name was made public. And he was having seizures in the hippocampal areas. So this is a normal brain here, and then you can see that there was a resection. His hippocampus was removed on both sides. And they found that he was still able to recall old memories that he had from his childhood, like very far back throughout his life, but he could not make new memories. He could have short-term memory within a couple minutes, but you could come in the room and leave, and then as soon as you left, he would forget who you are, and was not able to make long-term memories for the rest of his life, but was able to speak and otherwise seem like a normal functioning person until you kind of left the room and came back in, and he had no idea who you are. I believe this is the second to last, just kidding, area that's in the lower brain that I want to talk about is the thalamus. And the thalamus on its own doesn't do anything particularly exciting, but it's a really important area to know about because pretty much all signals either coming up from the spinal cord or through other areas of the brain pass through this area. It's kind of like a relay area. And so all of these signals kind of come in through here, and sometimes that can be an indicator, depending on some symptoms that you might have, it can be an indicator that signals aren't getting through where they need to be in the thalamus, and there are a lot of devices that people have been making to try to help those connections bridge if you're having issues there. And finally, the basal ganglia is a collection of structures also in the midbrain. You can see the thalamus is right there, so this is kind of just sitting on top of it, and the limbic system would be right under it. And this is important for generating motion, so actually telling the upper areas of the brain, I would like to move, and then they kind of figure it out. And habits, so muscle memory, when we talk about that, this is, you can actually build some circuits that help you make that system faster, so it can just send that right out to the muscles as opposed to going up and doing that processing. And then your emotional regulation and reward system and mood also comes here. So you hear a lot of people talk about dopamine, I need dopamine, having a low dopamine moment, whatever it is. That is all coming from your basal ganglia. And so actually, if you are trying to treat with a neuroprosthetic, with something that stimulates your brain electrically for depression, anxiety, maybe bipolar disorder, this is a common target to hit because usually you have some neural death in one of these areas, and if you stimulate it, you can sort of overcome, to some extent, the damage that's done there. This is true for Parkinson's as well. Parkinson's, you have overactive motor generation. You can stimulate there and overcome that. So is it even useful to talk about the brain as a set of regions? So there are two theories of thought on this, which is localizationism, which is where specific structures do specific things and that is their only purpose. And then there are distributionists that say that there really aren't specific areas that do one thing. All of the brain is integrated in pretty much everything. But neuroscientists now all agree that it is somewhere right in the middle of this because different areas, all of the areas that I showed you are all pretty well established that they do those functions. Now they may do other functions and other parts in the brain will be working with those to kind of come together because the brain is always talking to itself. But for the most part, those areas are implicated in specific tasks. Trying to pin down consciousness is a little bit harder, but those things like motor and sensation is pretty well established. All right, so how much time do we have? Because I could stop here and do the neuron next time.
We do have 10 minutes.
We do? All right, I think I can get through this then. So we talked about the brain as a large structure, and next time we're going to talk about how the brain functions electrically. But there's one really important thing that we have to go over first, which is the functional cell of the brain, the neuron. And this is where our thoughts are being transmitted, and they connect together to do basically everything that our body does, act as processing units and wires. So they look like this. They're highly specialized cells, and there are over 10,000 known types of neurons. So this is just sort of a basic representation of the most common types of neuron. It's called multipolar because you've got a lot of dendrites coming out here. And so there are three parts that you want to pay attention to, which are the dendrites up here. And the dendrites receive signals, so they branch all around and they try to connect with other neurons. They take the signals coming in and they send the signals to the soma, which is the cell body. Just like any other neuron, this is going to have mitochondria, a nucleus, all of those things that you would find in normal cells. And this is where that processing actually happens, where the neuron decides, okay, do I want to transmit a signal called an action potential, down to the next neuron, or do I want to not fire? And it does that based on all of the connections that it can make, which is up to 10,000 connections with other neurons. And based on all of those signals that it's getting, it decides whether it wants to make an action potential and tell another neuron, send it its signal. Then we have, to actually transmit that signal out, we have this axon, which can be really, really long. And that carries the signal all the way down to, this is still part of the axon, but the axon terminals, which connect to dendrites of other neurons to transmit that signal. Now, axons can be quite long, like I said, but however, they're very thin. Does anybody have a guess as to what the longest axon is in the human body? So the longest cell that we have in the human body. Anybody want to take a guess? John, got an idea for your own candy? Take a guess. Throw out a number.
Oh, you want to know how long it is?
Yeah.
I thought you were asking for a specific name. And I was like, I don't have
No.
my memory banks. My
Just take a guess. Random.
Doesn't work well for me. 3 meters?
1 meter, but you're in the scale. That's you're at least in the right unit. So, yeah, we have neurons that extend from our hips all the way down to our toes, and those are the longest neurons that we have in our body. And if you think of a single cell, that's really crazy that they can get that long.
This and this while you were talking about neuron. I just did bad at with numbers.
No, you're fine. So yeah, it's a meter is pretty long, but even crazier, in the blue whale, they have neurons that are 33 meters long, which is just insane. And they're actually large enough that you can see them with the naked eye. And a cell that large is just kind of crazy because we think of these as pretty microscopic most of the time. So just focusing in a little bit more on these, and we're very close to wrapping up here. Just focusing in a little more on these. These are the dendrites. So again, these are taking in our signals. And they have these tiny, tiny little spines on it. And each of these are looking for axons of other neurons, which we can see coming in here. And they look to make these little connections, which are called synapses. The soma, again, like I said, is just a normal cell body, except that it does extra processing. And so if you're familiar with biology, you might be familiar with a lot of these terms. So this is just everything that the cell needs to function, but it's also creating chemicals called neurotransmitters, which are used to actually send that signal off across to another neuron. So that's another special thing that the soma does. And then we have the axon, which again is like a wire transmitting that signal out to reach other neurons. All right. Name the parts of the neuron. We got 3 parts. Let's start from the end, just to be a little bit more confusing. Anybody tell me what this is? Besides John, who I know has taken neuroscience classes. Yes?
The axon, specifically the axon terminal.
Very good. Even with the specifically, that's great. Very impressive. All right, how about this area here? Oh, that is part of what you just said. My bad. How about this area here? Anybody? Yeah.
Cell body or something.
Yep, very good. And what about this last area? Yes. Very good. Very good. Hopefully you guys are keeping track of Candy. You can bombard John afterwards. That's awesome. So one thing that you may have heard people talk about, oh, men have more gray matter, women have more white matter. It's not really true. It's at least like proportionally wise, it is not true. And that doesn't really matter. Basically, what this is gray matter are our cell bodies. So you can see that these are out on the outskirts of the brain, and the white matter is just the wiring that connects them. So we all have the same amount, where the white part is just the wire, the axon coming out of those cell bodies. So really, there is no difference, and don't listen to the things that you hear about that. And then finally, this is the last couple slides here. There are other cells in the brain. About 90% of the cells in the brain are actually not neurons. The neurons are really, really needy cells, and they have a lot of other cells that kind of help it survive and do what it needs to do. So you may have seen these little tubes that go around the neuron. These are some tubes over here. These are collectively called the myelin sheath. And basically all that is if you're familiar with electrical engineering, you put kind of a casing around the wire, the rubber casing around the metal wire at the inside, which helps it transmit that signal, helps it conduct more efficiently. And that's essentially all that this is doing here. It's just these are individual cells in the peripheral nervous system, one cell that sends multiple raps, and that's all that it's doing, is just helping to transmit that signal. Then we'll skip these because this is just kind of moving fluid around. But then we have microglia, which are really, really cool, and I'll show us like a 7-second video on the next slide. These are your white blood cells of the brain. So they have all of these arms, and they kind of reach out, and they try to find pathogens, and they grab them, and then they eat those pathogens to make sure that the neurons are okay. And sometimes if a neuron is dead, they'll also go for those as well. And then the astrocyte kind of does everything else that could be needed. They're kind of like a handyman for the brain. And I'll talk more about the specific features that they do, but they're really important in holding the brain together, as well as creating synapses, making sure neurons are okay, giving them energy, stuff like that. So, this is on your computer, so we do not have access to it. But basically, like I said, it's okay. I'll send the video out in Slack if people are interested. But basically, it's a microscopic video of little microglia that are reaching out, and they find a pathogen. They all kind of come together and jump on it. And those videos are really cool. I'm going to send some about neurons developing as well in the Slack, because it's just very pretty. There we go. And this is the last slide. I just wanted to talk about a little bit more of the functions of the astrocyte, because they're really important. So they provide structure. When a neuron dies or when you have damage to your brain, they create a lot of scar tissue to prevent that neuron from firing to other ones and potentially damaging it. They help those neurons connect to each other and talk to each other, and they are important in repairing damage and guiding neurons to where they need to be. All right, yeah, so that is the end. I just wanted to wrap that up quickly because I know that we have people coming in, but are there any questions that people might have